The origin of species. Each species is a masterpiece of evolution that humanity could not possibly duplicate, even if we somehow accomplished the creation of new organisms by genetic engineering. Ernst Mayr, a young German zoologist, traveled to Dutch New Guinea in 1928 to collect plants and animals. He was inexperienced, but was backed by Lord Walter Rothschild, who wanted to expand his private collection of different bird species. At the end of his 2-year journey, Mayr discovered that the locals of New Guinea had acknowledged 136 different types of local birds in the Arfak Mountains. Western zoologists, using their own scientific method, have discovered 137 different types of species. Now, how is this possible? The number of different species that the locals discovered is strikingly identical to the number Western zoologists have found. Mayr was convinced that discontinuities of nature are not arbitrary, but an objective fact. When looking at different animals like the big cat family, we can immediately identify differences between each species. Even though there is variation among individuals, you can still group them into organism space. These clusters can be seen in all organisms that reproduce. The problem of speciation can first arise when trying to define what a species is. A species is a discrete cluster of organisms that has variation within groups and can reproduce sexually. The famous English naturalist Charles Darwin did not fully understand how diversity occurs. He was knowledgeable on how a single species can change over time, but he did not figure out how millions of different species come from one ancestor. It wasn't until the 1930s where speciation was seriously addressed, which led to the different species concepts being created. One of the species concepts is known as the morphological species concept. A basic understanding of this concept is grouping individuals that look more like each other together than other individuals. It based solely on appearance, which creates a problem. In some sexually dimorphic species, the male and female can look a lot different, causing researchers to misclassify two genders as two different species. In addition, there is more variation within a species that can cause reproductive isolation. This can be seen with plants that require pollination by another organism. The structure and attraction of two similarly looking plants can be pollinated by either a hummingbird or bee, but the pollen from the two plants will never be exchanged due to the plants attracting different species. The other species concept is the biological species concept, which bases species on sexual reproductivity. This concept is more widely accepted since members of the same species can interbreed easily. However, using the reproductive criterion for species status cannot be applied to the fossil record. There is no way of knowing about reproductive isolation, so the morphological species concept must be used in that situation. Another problem for the biological species concept is that asexual organisms will be misclassified as well, since they do not reproduce sexually. Overall, if how reproductive barriers evolve is discovered, then there is an explanation for the origin of species.
Hybrids. Let's assume features were accidental byproducts of genetic divergence, caused by genetic drift or natural selection. The genome of an isolated population will go through a huge change, which causes it to not work well when combined in a hybrid. Unfortunately, they either die prematurely or live to be sterile. Geographic speciation. The theory states the evolution of genetic isolation between populations requires that they first be geographically isolated. Why is geographic speciation important? Well, without isolation, selection would need to work against the interbreeding that continually brings individuals together and mixes their genes. Geographic isolation is very common. Examples of geographic isolation includes glacier spreading, deserts forming, continent drifts, and mountain ranges rising. Populations can also become separated by accidental long-distance dispersal. Has there been enough time for geographic speciation? Speciation. Each ancestral twig splits in two, which also splits and goes on and on and on. But speciation happens very fast. Time is not an issue. Geographic speciation theory predictions. One prediction says if populations must usually be physically isolated from one another to become species, then we should be able to find recent formed species in different but nearby areas. To figure out how long ago the species was in existence, biologists look for differences in DNA. Plants are a great example the book has given. You can find pairs of sister species of flowering plants in eastern Asia and eastern North America. Another prediction is the assumption that geographic species remains occurring in nature, which would be able to find isolated populations of a single species which have begun to speciate, which would have amounts of reproductive isolation from other populations. And the final prediction would be finding reproductive isolation between a pair of physically isolated populations increases slowly over time.